My grandfather died in the spring of 2019, alone in a cabin he had built with his own hands over 60 years ago. He was 91 years old and had not left those hills in eastern Kentucky since my grandmother passed in 1982. The county coroner said he died in his sleep, which was a small mercy. He had lived a hard life in those mountains, and he deserved a peaceful end. I had not seen him in nearly 15 years. Life had gotten in the way it always does. I moved to Cincinnati after college, got married, built a career in accounting, and slowly let the distance between us grow until phone calls became Christmas cards, and Christmas cards became nothing at all. When the lawyer called to tell me I had inherited his property, I felt a guilt so sharp it nearly doubled me over. The timing seemed almost providential. My marriage had ended 6 months earlier, when I discovered my wife had been having an affair with her personal trainer. The divorce was brutal and expensive, leaving me with half the savings and all of the anger. I needed to get away from Cincinnati. I needed to be somewhere quiet where I could think and heal and figure out what came next. The cabin seemed like the perfect escape. I drove down in early June, following roads that grew narrower and more neglected the deeper I went into the hills. The last 10 miles were unpaved, winding through forests so dense the sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. When I finally reached the cabin, I understood why my grandfather had loved this place. It sat in a small clearing at the base of a ridge, surrounded by ancient oaks and tulip poplars. A creek ran behind the property, and the only sounds were birdsong and whine through the leaves. The cabin itself had seen better days. The roof needed patching. The porch sagged in the middle. The windows were clouded with decades of grime, but the bones were solid, and I had nothing but time. I spent the first week cleaning and assessing the damage. The inside was cluttered with my grandfather's belongings, artifacts of a life lived simply and alone. Old newspapers stacked in corners, mason jars filled with nails and screws, a wood-burning stove that looked like it had not been cleaned in years. I worked methodically, sorting through his possessions and making lists of repairs that needed to be done. The days were long and exhausting. I would wake at dawn and work until the light failed, then sit on the porch with a beer and watch the stars emerge through the gap in the trees. I had never seen so many stars. In Cincinnati, light pollution reduced the night sky to a handful of faint points. Here, the Milky Way stretched across the darkness like a river of light. For the first time in months, I felt something like peace. That changed on the third week. I was sitting on the porch around 10 o'clock, listening to the chorus of insects and frogs that filled the night. The sound was constant and rhythmic, a wall of noise that I had come to find comforting. Then, without warning, it stopped. The silence was so sudden and complete that I sat up straight in my chair. I had read somewhere that animals go quiet when a predator is near. I scanned the tree line, looking for the reflection of eyes, but saw nothing. Just darkness pressing in from all sides. Then I heard something beneath the cabin. It was a soft, scraping sound, like something dragging itself across dirt. I told myself it was an animal. Raccoons were common in these hills. Possums, too. There were probably dozens of creatures that made their homes under old porches. The sound continued for several minutes, moving from one end of the cabin to the other. I stomped my foot on the porch, expecting to scare off whatever was down there. The scraping stopped. Then I heard the whisper. It was so faint, I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. A low, guttural sound that could have been the wind if there had been any wind. But the night was perfectly still. The sound came again, louder this time, and I realized it was not wind. It was voices, multiple voices, speaking in sounds that were almost words, but not quite. I stood up slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. I walked to the edge of the porch and looked down at the darkness beneath. I could see nothing. The gap between the porch and the ground was maybe 18 inches, too narrow for anything large, but plenty of room for something to hide. The whispering stopped. I went inside and locked the door. I told myself I was being ridiculous. An animal, a weird echo from the creek, something rational that my tired mind had twisted into something sinister. I went to bed and eventually fell asleep, though I kept the lamp burning all night. The next morning, I walked around the cabin and looked for signs of whatever had been under the porch. I found tracks in the soft dirt near the foundation. At first I thought they were animal prints. Then I looked closer and my stomach dropped. They were handprints, small and narrow, like a child's hands, but with fingers that seemed too long. They led from the porch to a hole at the base of the foundation where some of the stones had crumbled away. The hole was maybe 2 feet wide, disappearing into darkness beneath the cabin. I spent the day trying to convince myself there was a rational explanation. Maybe some kids from a nearby holler were playing pranks on the city guy. Maybe a homeless person had been using the space under the cabin for shelter. I had heard of stranger things. That night, I armed myself with a flashlight and sat on the porch, waiting. The insects sang their endless song. The stars wheeled overhead. Around midnight, the sound stopped again. The scraping began almost immediately. Louder this time, more confident. I could hear movement under the floorboards, multiple things crawling in different directions. Then the whispers started. I turned on the flashlight and walked to the edge of the porch. I crouched down and pointed the beam into the darkness beneath. Eyes reflected back at me. Human eyes. There were at least a dozen of them, clustered in the shadows maybe 6 feet from where I crouched. They were attached to shapes I could not fully make out. Thin bodies, pale skin, limbs that seemed to bend at wrong angles. They were huddled together like animals, watching me with an intensity that made my blood freeze. I opened my mouth to say something, but no words came out. One of them made a sound, that same guttural whisper I had heard the night before. Others joined in, a chorus of almost words that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then, as if responding to some signal I could not perceive, they scattered. They moved fast, faster than anything human should be able to move in that cramped space. They poured into the hole at the foundation and were gone. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my grandfather's chair with a kitchen knife in my hand and watched the door until dawn. The next morning, I drove into town and found the sheriff's office. It was a small building next to the post office, staffed by a single deputy who looked like he was about 100 years old. I told him what I had seen. I expected him to laugh at me or suggest I had been drinking. He did neither. His face went pale as I described the eyes under the porch. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. He told me there were stories about people who lived in these hollows, people who had been here for generations, isolated from the rest of the world. Some of them had never integrated into society. They lived in the deep woods, in caves, and abandoned mines, and places no one else would go. Over the years, they had become something else, something not quite human anymore. He called them the Hollow Folk. He said my grandfather knew about them. Everyone who lived in these hills knew about them. They stayed away from populated areas most of the time, but they were drawn to isolated cabins and abandoned buildings. They were curious about the people who lived above ground. Sometimes they would watch for weeks before moving on. Other times they would not move on at all. He told me to leave. He said I should pack my things and drive back to Cincinnati and never come back. He said my grandfather had lived with them for 40 years, and that was why he never left the cabin. He said some kind of understanding had existed between them, but that understanding died when my grandfather did. I asked him what would happen if I stayed. He did not answer. He just shook his head and looked at me with something that might have been pity. I should have listened to him. I should have gotten in my car and driven away and let the cabin rot. But I was angry. Angry at my ex-wife. Angry at myself. Angry at a world that kept taking things from me. I was not going to be driven out of my own property by some inbred hillbillies living under my porch. I went to the hardware store and bought supplies. Concrete mix, steel mesh, lumber. I spent 3 days sealing every gap in the foundation. I filled the hole where they had been entering and covered it with a steel plate bolted to the stone. I reinforced the porch and made sure there was no way anything could get underneath. On the 4th night, I sat on the porch with a shotgun across my lap and waited. The insects went silent around 11. The whispers started a few minutes later, but they were not coming from under the cabin. They were coming from the tree line. I raised the shotgun and pointed it at the darkness. My flashlight beam swept across the trees and found nothing. The whispers continued, circling around the clearing, moving from one side to the other. I could hear movement in the brush, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. They were surrounding me. Then I saw them. They emerged from the shadows one by one, standing at the edge of the tree line in a rough semicircle. There were more than I had seen under the porch, 20 at least, maybe more. They were thin and pale, their bodies twisted into postures that did not look natural. Their eyes caught the moonlight and reflected it back like animal eyes. They did not approach. They just stood there, watching me, whispering in that language that was not quite language. I raised the shotgun and fired into the air. They did not flinch. They did not run. They just kept watching. I fired again and again. The shots echoed through the hollow and faded into silence. The figures remained where they were. I went inside and barricaded the door. I pushed furniture against the windows. I sat in the middle of the room with the shotgun and waited for dawn. They did not try to get in, but I could hear them all night, moving around the cabin, whispering to each other, occasionally scratching at the walls. When the sun rose, they were gone. I left that morning. I packed what I could fit in my car and drove away without looking back. I did not stop until I reached Lexington. I checked into a hotel and slept for 16 hours straight. I never went back to the cabin. I tried to sell it, but no one wanted property that far from civilization. Eventually, I just let it go. Let the county take it for unpaid taxes. Let it return to the forest and whatever lived there. But I still think about those eyes sometimes. Still hear those whispers in my dreams. Still wonder what would have happened if I had stayed one more night. The deputy told me my grandfather had lived with them for 40 years, that some kind of understanding had existed between them. I never found out what that understanding was. I never found out what they wanted or where they came from or how long they had been living in those hills. Some questions do not have answers. Some places are not meant to be understood, and some things, once you have seen them, you can never unsee. I live in Chicago now. I chose it specifically because it is flat and open, and there are no mountains for hundreds of miles. I live on the 12th floor of an apartment building with concrete beneath me and nothing but air. But sometimes, late at night, I hear scratching sounds from somewhere below, and I try very hard not to think about what might be making them. I have hiked over 2,000 miles of the Appalachian Trail across 15 years. I have encountered bears and rattlesnakes and storms that turn trails into rivers. I have been lost for days at a time. I have pushed my body to the absolute limits of exhaustion. But nothing I experienced in all those years of hiking prepared me for what happened on Hickory Ridge in the summer of 2017. I was 34 years old and going through what I can only describe as a midlife recalibration. My job in software development had become unbearable. The stress was affecting my health, my relationships, my ability to sleep. My therapist suggested I take some time away from screens and deadlines and reconnect with nature. She knew I had been a serious hiker in my 20s before career and responsibilities consumed my life. I decided to tackle a section of the AT I had never completed, a remote stretch in southwestern Virginia that wound through some of the most isolated terrain on the entire trail. Most thru-hikers avoided it because the elevation changes were brutal and the trail maintenance was minimal, but I wanted isolation. I wanted to be somewhere that cell phones did not work and other people did not exist. I wanted to remember what it felt like to be alone with my thoughts in the forest. I got exactly what I asked for. The first 3 days were everything I had hoped for. The weather was perfect. Cool mornings and warm afternoons with clear skies stretching from horizon to horizon. The trail was challenging but manageable. I fell into a rhythm of walking and resting and setting up camp that felt almost meditative. My mind quieted. My body remembered how to move through wilderness. I started to feel like myself again. On the 4th day, I crossed Hickory Ridge. The ridge was not marked on my topographic map, but I found a weathered wooden sign nailed to a tree at the summit. The paint had faded to the point of illegibility, but I could just make out the words Hickory Point carved into the wood. The view from the top was spectacular. Rolling mountains covered in dense forest stretching in every direction. No roads, no buildings, no signs of human presence as far as the eye could see. I sat on a flat rock near the sign and ate lunch. A granola bar and some trail mix washed down with water from my canteen. I was completely alone. I had not seen another hiker since the second morning when I passed a young couple heading north. According to my map, the nearest town was over 20 miles away. That was when I first heard the sound. It came from somewhere behind me, deeper in the forest I had just walked through. A rustling in the underbrush. Not loud, not alarming, just the sound of something moving through leaves and branches. I turned and looked but saw nothing, just endless trees and shadow. I told myself it was a deer, or a squirrel, or the wind moving through the brush. The forest was full of sounds if you paid attention. I finished my lunch and packed up my things. But as I started down the trail, I noticed something strange. The forest had gone quiet. No birdsong, no insects buzzing, No squirrels chattering in the branches. Just silence broken only by the crunch of my boots on the trail and the soft whisper of wind through the leaves. And something else. Footsteps. They were faint at first. So faint I almost convinced myself I was hearing an echo of my own movement. But the rhythm was wrong. When I walked, they walked. When I stopped, they stopped. But there was a slight delay. A half-second pause before whatever was behind me adjusted to match my pace. I turned around and saw nothing. The trail curved back through dense forest, visibility limited to maybe 50 yards before the trees swallowed everything. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound, but I could feel eyes on me. A prickling sensation at the back of my neck that made every hair stand on end. I walked faster. The footsteps matched my pace. I broke into a jog, moving down the trail as quickly as I could with a 40-pound pack on my back. The footsteps behind me sped up too. I could hear them clearly now. Not boots on dirt, something softer, like bare feet slapping against the earth. I stopped abruptly and spun around. Nothing. The trail was empty. The forest was still. But the feeling of being watched had not gone away. If anything, it had intensified. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, scanning the trees, searching for any sign of movement. Then I heard the giggle. It came from my left, somewhere in the trees, maybe 30 yards off the trail. A high-pitched sound that could have been a child's laugh if children laughed like that. But there was something wrong with it, something broken. It sounded like someone who had heard laughter described, but had never actually experienced it. Like a recording played at the wrong speed. I did not wait to hear it again. I ran. I ran down that trail faster than I had ever run in my life. My pack bounced against my back. Branches scratched my face and arms. I stumbled over roots and rocks but somehow kept my footing. The footsteps behind me matched my pace, getting louder, getting closer. And the giggling continued. It was not just coming from one direction anymore. I could hear it on both sides of the trail now. Multiple voices, multiple sources, all making that same distorted, inhuman sound. They were running alongside me in the trees, keeping pace, herding me down the mountain like prey. I do not know how long I ran. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. Time lost all meaning. There was only the trail and the trees and the terrible sounds that followed me through the forest. I burst out of the tree line and nearly ran into a road. For a moment I just stood there, gasping for breath, my legs trembling so badly I could barely stand. The road was narrow and unpaved, barely more than 2 ruts in the dirt. But it was civilization. It was a way out. I heard an engine approaching. A pickup truck rounded the curve and slowed when the driver saw me standing in the middle of the road. He was an older man, maybe 60, with a weathered face and calloused hands that suggested a lifetime of manual labor. He rolled down his window and looked at me with a mixture of concern and caution. I must have been a sight, sweating and bleeding from a dozen small cuts, my eyes wide with terror, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. He asked if I was okay. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out in a jumbled rush. Something following me. Footsteps, giggling in the trees. I knew I sounded insane. I knew there was no way to describe what I had experienced without sounding like I had lost my mind. But the man did not look at me like I was crazy. He looked at me like he understood. He told me to get in the truck. He did not ask questions. He did not demand explanations. He just unlocked the passenger door and waited for me to climb inside. As we drove away, I turned and looked back toward the tree line. They were standing there, 3 figures at the edge of the forest, maybe 100 yards from where the truck had stopped. They were shaped like people, but something was wrong with their proportions. Their limbs were too long, their bodies were too thin. They stood perfectly still, watching the truck drive away with an intensity I could feel even from that distance. They did not chase us. They did not move at all. They just watched. I asked the man if he could see them. He glanced in his rearview mirror and his jaw tightened. He pressed the accelerator and the truck sped up. He did not answer my question until we were 5 miles down the road. Then he pulled over and turned to face me. He asked where I had been hiking. I told him about Hickory Ridge. He nodded slowly, like I had confirmed something he already suspected. He told me there were things in these mountains that most people did not believe in. Things that had been here long before settlers arrived. Things that stayed hidden most of the time but would sometimes take an interest in hikers who wandered too far off the beaten path. He said the locals knew about them. They had different names for them depending on which holler you were from. Some called them the Wild Ones. Others called them the forgotten people. A few old-timers used a word he would not repeat because he said speaking it could draw their attention. I asked him what they wanted. He said no one knew for certain. Sometimes they just watched, followed people for miles without ever making contact. Other times they were more aggressive. Hikers had gone missing in these mountains for generations. Most were written off as accidents or exposure or animal attacks. But the locals knew better. He drove me to a motel in the nearest town and waited until I was safely inside before leaving. He did not give me his name. He did not ask for mine. He just told me to stay off Hickory Ridge and never come back. I took his advice. I cut my hiking trip short and drove home the next morning. I told myself I would process what had happened eventually, give it time to fade into the realm of strange experiences that could be explained away with enough distance and rationalization. But it did not fade. For weeks after I returned home, I had the feeling I was being watched. I would wake in the middle of the night convinced there was someone standing outside my bedroom window. I would hear sounds in my backyard that did not match any animal I knew. Once, around 3 in the morning, I heard giggling outside my front door. I moved 6 months later, sold my house and relocated to a different state. I told everyone it was for a job opportunity, but the truth was simpler and harder to admit. I was running from something I could not explain or understand, running from a sound I heard every night in my dreams. I still hike sometimes, short trails in populated areas where other people are always within earshot. I never go alone anymore. I never venture off the marked paths, and I never, ever return to Virginia. But sometimes, even now, I feel eyes on me when I am in the woods. I hear footsteps that do not quite match my own. I catch movement in my peripheral vision that disappears when I turn to look. And sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet, I hear that giggle, distant and distorted, coming from somewhere I cannot identify. I do not know what followed me from Hickory Ridge. I do not know if it was human or something else entirely. I do not know why it chose me or what it wanted, or whether it ever truly let me go. All I know is that something in those mountains took notice of me that day. Something ancient and patient and curious. And I have spent the last 7 years wondering if it is still watching, waiting, biding its time until the day I wander too far from safety again. I try not to think about it. I try to live a normal life and convince myself that what happened on Hickory Ridge was an isolated incident, a strange encounter that will never repeat itself. But deep down, I know the truth. They do not forget, and neither do I. The summer of 2020 was supposed to be a simple job. The Census Bureau was hiring temporary workers to help with the decennial count, and I needed the money. I had just finished my master's degree in social work and was drowning in student loans while waiting for a full-time position to open up. The census work paid well and offered flexible hours. It seemed like the perfect bridge between graduate school and a real career. They assigned me to Hickory County in southeastern Kentucky. It was one of the poorest counties in the state, tucked into the mountains along the Tennessee border. Most of the population lived in small towns or scattered throughout the hollows that cut into the ridges like wounds. The terrain was challenging, but I had grown up in rural Ohio and thought I understood what I was getting into. I was wrong. The first few weeks went smoothly. I drove from house to house, knocked on doors, asked my questions, and recorded the answers on my tablet. Most people were friendly, if a little suspicious of government workers. A few refused to participate, which was their right. I marked their addresses and moved on. By mid-July, I had worked through most of my assigned territory. The remaining addresses were increasingly remote, accessible only by roads that my GPS could not find. I started relying on paper maps and hand-drawn directions from the county office. Some days I would spend more time driving than actually conducting interviews. Then I received the assignment for Bledso Holler. The address was listed as 1147 Bledso Holler Road, but when I searched for it, nothing came up. No GPS coordinates, no satellite imagery, no record of the road existing at all. I went to the county office and asked for help. The woman behind the counter was in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. When I mentioned Bledso Holler, something changed in her expression, a flicker of recognition followed by something that looked like concern. She told me the holler was real but not on any modern maps. She said it had been excluded from official records decades ago. When I asked why, she did not answer. She just pulled out a piece of paper and drew directions by hand. Turn left at the old sawmill. Follow the creek for 2 miles. Look for the split oak. I asked if anyone still lived there. She paused for a long moment before answering. She said there were people in that holler, but they did not like visitors. She said I should go during the day and leave before dark. She said if they did not want to talk to me, I should respect that and leave immediately. I thanked her for the directions and headed out. The drive took nearly an hour, even though the holler was only 15 miles from town. The roads grew progressively worse the deeper I went into the mountains. Pavement gave way to gravel. Gravel gave way to dirt. Eventually the road disappeared entirely, swallowed by undergrowth and erosion. I parked at the end of what had once been a road and continued on foot. The forest was dense and humid, the air thick with the smell of rotting vegetation and something else. Something animal. I followed a faint trail that wound along a creek bed, ducking under low branches and stepping over fallen logs. After about half a mile, I found the cabin. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by massive oak trees. The structure looked ancient, hand-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney rising from one end, a single door, and 2 small windows that had been covered with oilcloth instead of glass. Smoke drifted from the chimney despite the summer heat, thin and gray against the green canopy. There was no vehicle, no power lines, no satellite dish, no signs of modern life at all. It looked like something from another century, preserved in the isolation of the mountains. I approached slowly, my census tablet clutched in my hands like a shield. I called out a greeting as I walked, announcing myself as a census worker, explaining that I was there to count the residents for the federal government. My voice sounded wrong in that clearing, too loud, too modern, like I was intruding on something that did not want to be disturbed. I reached the door and knocked. For a long moment, nothing happened. I could hear movement inside, shuffling footsteps, whispered voices, but no one answered. I knocked again and repeated my introduction. The door opened. A man stood in the threshold. He was tall and impossibly thin, with pale skin that seemed to have never seen direct sunlight. His eyes were what I noticed first. They were too large for his face, the irises a pale gray that seemed almost colorless. He stared at me without blinking, without speaking, without any expression I could read. I started to explain why I was there, fumbling through my rehearsed speech about the census and the importance of being counted. The words felt foolish as they left my mouth, meaningless in the face of whatever was looking at me through that doorway. The man did not respond. He just stood there, watching me with those unsettling eyes. Behind him, I could see others moving in the shadows of the cabin. Women and children, I thought at first, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized something was wrong with them. They had the same pale skin as the man, the same oversized eyes. They moved through the cabin in strange, jerky motions, their joints bending at angles that did not look natural. One of them turned to look at me, and I saw that her neck rotated too far, her head swiveling almost completely around before stopping. I stopped talking mid-sentence. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the sounds of the forest and the soft shuffle of movement inside the cabin. I could feel their eyes on me, all of them, watching, waiting. I had the sudden, overwhelming sense that I was being evaluated, assessed, that whatever decision was being made about me would determine whether I left that clearing alive. I took a step backward. The man in the doorway tilted his head. The movement was wrong, too fluid, too far, like a bird examining something it had never seen before. I took another step. A sound came from inside the cabin, a clicking noise, almost like language, but not quite. Others joined in, a chorus of clicks and guttural sounds that seemed to communicate something I could not understand. I turned and walked away. It took everything I had not to run. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to put as much distance between myself and that cabin as possible. But some deeper instinct, some survival mechanism I did not know I possessed, told me that running would be the wrong choice. That running would trigger something I did not want to trigger. I walked back through the forest, following the creek, retracing my steps to where I had parked my car. The entire time I could feel them watching me. I never saw them in the trees, but I knew they were there, following, observing, making sure I was really leaving. When I reached my car, I got in and locked the doors and drove away as fast as the terrain would allow. I did not stop until I reached the paved road. I did not breathe normally until I was back in town. I went straight to the county office and found the woman who had given me directions. I told her what I had seen. I told her about the man with the pale skin and oversized eyes. I told her about the others in the cabin and the way they moved and the sounds they made. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she nodded slowly, like she had heard this story before. She told me to mark the address as inaccessible. She told me to move on to my next assignment. She told me not to go back to Bledso Holler. I asked her who those people were. I asked her why they were not in any records. I asked her what was wrong with them. She was quiet for a long time. Then she told me something that I have never forgotten. She said the people in Bledso Holler had been there for as long as anyone could remember. They had lived in that clearing before Kentucky was a state, before the first settlers arrived, before anyone kept records. They kept to themselves, and the town left them alone. It was an arrangement that had worked for generations. I asked why they were removed from the census in 1952. Her expression changed. A shadow passed over her face. She told me a census worker had gone to Bledso Holler that year. A young man from Lexington who did not understand the old arrangements. He had insisted on counting everyone, insisted on following the rules. He went into the holler and never came back. They found his car a week later, parked at the end of the road where I had parked mine. They found his clipboard in the creek bed, the papers ruined by water. They never found him. After that, the county made a decision. Bledso Holler was removed from all official records. The road was allowed to grow over. Anyone who asked about it was told it did not exist. I asked if the family in the holler had killed the census worker. She did not answer. She just told me that some places were better left alone. Some people were better left uncounted. She said the arrangement had kept everyone safe for 70 years, and she saw no reason to change it now. I wanted to argue. I wanted to demand answers. But something in her eyes told me that pushing further would be a mistake, that there were things about these mountains that outsiders were not meant to understand. I finished my assignment in Hickory County and transferred to a different territory. I never went back to Bledso Holler. I never reported what I had seen to anyone at the Census Bureau. I marked the address as inaccessible, just like she told me, and I moved on. But I still think about that cabin sometimes. I still see those pale faces in my dreams. I still hear that clicking sound when the world gets quiet. I did some research after I left Kentucky. I searched through historical records and old newspaper archives and genealogical databases. I found nothing about Bledso Holler or the family that lived there. It was like they had been erased from history. But I did find one thing, a brief mention in a journal from the 1,840 written by a surveyor who had been mapping the region for the state of Kentucky. He wrote about a holler in the mountains where a family lived who did not speak English or any language he recognized. He wrote that they had pale skin and strange eyes and moved in ways that unsettled him. He wrote that the Cherokee who still lived in the area at that time called them the Old Ones and refused to enter the holler under any circumstances. The surveyor recommended that the holler be excluded from official maps. He wrote that some places should remain unknown. I think about that sometimes. I think about how long that family has been living in those mountains. I think about what isolation does to people over generations. I think about the census worker who disappeared in 1952 and whether he is still in that holler somewhere, counted among the residents in whatever strange census those people keep for themselves. I left the Census Bureau at the end of the summer. I got a job at a social services agency in Columbus and tried to forget about what I had seen. I told myself it was just an isolated community with unusual customs. Nothing supernatural, nothing impossible. Just people who had been separated from the rest of the world for too long. But I know that is not the whole truth. I know what I saw in that cabin. I know how they moved. I know how they looked at me. And I know, deep in my bones, that they are still there, waiting, watching, counting the days until someone else finds their way into Bledso Holler. I hope whoever that person is has the sense to turn around and leave. Because I do not think everyone who enters that holler gets the choice I had. I think some of them become part of the count. I needed the job. That is the only reason I took it. Nobody works the night shift at a gas station in the middle of nowhere because they want to. They do it because they have no other choice. In the summer of 2018, I had no other choice. I was 23 years old and had just dropped out of community college for the second time. My parents had made it clear I was not welcome to live at home anymore unless I was either in school or working full-time. School was not working out. That left full-time employment. The gas station was on Route 23, about 15 miles south of Pikeville in the hills of eastern Kentucky. It was one of those old independent stations that had somehow survived the expansion of corporate chains. A single building with 4 pumps, a small convenience store, and a garage bay that had not been used in years. The owner was a man named Earl, who lived in a trailer behind the property and only emerged during the day to count the register and restock the shelves. He hired me on the spot when I walked in looking for work. He did not ask for references or a resume. He just looked me up and down and asked if I could work nights. I said yes. He handed me a key and told me to start the following evening. The shift ran from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, 8 hours alone in a fluorescent lit box surrounded by darkness and forest. The pay was minimum wage plus whatever I could skim from the register, which Earl openly encouraged as long as I did not get greedy. The first few weeks were exactly what I expected. Boring, lonely, monotonous. I would sit behind the counter and read magazines or watch videos on my phone. A few customers would trickle in throughout the night. Truckers heading north to Ohio or south to Tennessee. Locals making late-night beer runs. The occasional lost tourist who had wandered off the highway looking for a shortcut. I developed a routine: make coffee at midnight, clean the bathrooms at 2, restock the coolers at 4, count the register at 5:30. By the time Earl showed up to relieve me at 6, I was usually half asleep and ready to collapse into bed. It was a nothing job, a placeholder until something better came along. I did not expect it to change my life. Then I met the visitors. It happened on a Thursday night in late August. I remember because Thursdays were always the slowest nights. Sometimes I would go hours without seeing a single customer. I was sitting behind the counter around 1 in the morning, scrolling through my phone, when I noticed movement outside. The station was bordered by forest on 3 sides, dense Appalachian woodland that pressed right up against the edge of the parking lot. During the day, it looked picturesque. At night, it was a wall of impenetrable darkness. Something was emerging from that darkness. I watched through the window as a figure stepped out of the tree line and walked toward the station. The motion-activated lights clicked on as they crossed the parking lot, illuminating them in harsh white light. It was a woman. At least, I thought it was a woman. She was thin and tall, wearing a dress that looked like it belonged in a photograph from 50 years ago. The fabric was faded and torn, covered in dirt and leaves like she had been crawling through the forest. Her hair hung in long matted strands that obscured most of her face. She walked slowly toward the front door, not the hesitant walk of someone who was lost or confused. A deliberate, purposeful stride that suggested she knew exactly where she was going. I stood up from my chair, ready to greet her, ready to ask if she needed help. This was coal country. Poverty was everywhere. It was not unusual to see people in rough condition, but something stopped me. She reached the door and stopped. She did not try to open it. She did not knock. She just stood there, maybe 2 feet from the glass, and looked at me. I could see her face now. It was gaunt and pale, the skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. Her eyes were what got me. They were open wide, unblinking, fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. There was no expression in them, no curiosity, no need, just a flat, empty stare that seemed to look through me rather than at me. I took a step toward the door. I was going to ask if she was okay. I was going to offer help. She opened her mouth. What came out was not a word. It was not a scream. It was something between, a sound that started low and rose in pitch, wavering and broken, like a voice that had forgotten how to make human sounds. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. The sound burrowed into my ears and settled somewhere deep in my chest, triggering a primal fear I did not know I possessed. I stumbled backward and hit the counter. My phone clattered to the floor. I could not move. I could not breathe. I just stared at the woman through the glass as she closed her mouth and resumed her silent watching. She stood there for hours. I stayed behind the counter, too terrified to move, watching her watch me. Around 4 in the morning, just as the first gray light began to touch the horizon, she turned and walked back toward the tree line. She did not look back. She just disappeared into the forest like she had never been there at all. I called Earl as soon as the sun was up. I told him what had happened. I expected him to think I was crazy. I expected him to fire me on the spot. He did neither. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked me if the woman had tried to open the door. I said no. He asked if I had gone outside. I said no. He told me that was good. He told me I had done the right thing. I asked him what the hell was going on. Who was that woman? Why was she standing outside the station in the middle of the night? He sighed heavily, like he had been dreading this conversation. He told me they had been coming to the station for as long as he could remember. His father had owned the station before him, and they came then too. They always came at night. They always emerged from the forest. They never spoke, except for that sound. That terrible, inhuman sound. He did not know who they were. He did not know where they came from. He only knew that they had been in these hills for a very long time. Longer than the station, longer than the road, maybe longer than the town itself. He told me the rules. Never open the door when they come, never go outside, never acknowledge them in any way, just wait until dawn and they will leave. I asked him what would happen if I broke those rules. He did not answer. He just told me to follow them and I would be fine. I should have quit that night. I should have walked away and found another job and never looked back. But I needed the money, and some stupid, stubborn part of me wanted to prove that I was not afraid. So I stayed. They did not come every night. Sometimes weeks would pass without an incident. I would almost convince myself that the woman had been a one-time thing, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and isolation. Then they would return. It was never the same person twice. Sometimes it was a man in overalls that looked like they had been buried and dug up again. Sometimes it was a child in a nightgown, standing barefoot in the parking lot despite the cold. Sometimes there were multiple figures, standing in a row at the edge of the tree line, watching the station without approaching. They always came between midnight and 4 in the morning. They always emerged from the same section of forest. They always wore clothes that were decades out of date, torn and dirty and wrong. And they always made that sound if I got too close to the door. I learned to ignore them. I would sit behind the counter with my back to the window and read or watch videos and pretend they were not there. If I heard them approach, I would turn up the volume on my phone. If I saw movement in my peripheral vision, I would force myself not to look. It almost worked. Almost. One night in November, I made a mistake. A trucker had stopped for fuel around 11. We chatted for a few minutes while he paid, talking about the weather and the road conditions and nothing important. He was a friendly guy, the kind of person who makes small talk with strangers because he spends too much time alone. After he left, I realized I had forgotten to lock the door behind him. I did not think about it. I just walked over to flip the lock. That is when I saw them. There were 5 of them standing in the parking lot. 3 men and 2 women, all in that same decrepit clothing, all with that same gaunt, expressionless face. They were arranged in a loose semicircle facing the door, facing me. I froze with my hand on the lock. One of the men tilted his head. The movement was wrong, too slow, too far, like his neck was made of rubber instead of bone. I should have stepped back. I should have locked the door and retreated behind the counter, but I did not. I just stood there, paralyzed, staring at them through the glass. The man took a step forward, then another. The others followed, moving in perfect unison, closing the distance between themselves and the door. I snapped out of my paralysis and stumbled backward. My hand caught the lock and twisted it, just as the man reached the door. He pressed his palm against the glass and pushed. The door rattled in its frame but held. He opened his mouth. The sound that came out was worse than anything I had heard before. It was layered now, harmonized by the others behind him, a chorus of broken voices that filled the night and seemed to vibrate in my skull. I covered my ears and fell to my knees, convinced that my head was going to split open from the pressure. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I looked up. They were still standing there, pressed against the glass, watching me with those empty eyes. But they were not making any sound. They were not trying to open the door. They were just watching. I crawled behind the counter and curled into a ball and stayed there until dawn. When Earl arrived at 6, he found me exactly where I had fallen. He helped me up and gave me a cup of coffee and did not ask any questions. He just told me to go home and get some rest. I quit the next day. I told Earl I could not do it anymore. I told him I would rather starve than spend another night in that station. He nodded like he understood. He did not try to change my mind. Before I left, I asked him one more time. I asked him what they were, where they came from, why they kept returning to a gas station in the middle of nowhere. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he told me something I have never forgotten. He said the station was built on a clearing that had been used for something else a long time ago, something before the road, before the town. He said there were stories about what used to happen in that clearing, but he did not know if they were true. He said some places attracted things, held on to them, would not let them go. He said the visitors were not trying to hurt anyone, they were just drawn to that spot. They had been coming for as long as anyone could remember, and they would probably keep coming long after everyone who knew about them was dead. I asked him if he was ever afraid. He looked at me with tired eyes and said he had stopped being afraid a long time ago. He said fear was exhausting. He said eventually you just learned to live with the things you could not understand. I left Kentucky a month later. I moved to Louisville and got a job at a warehouse and tried to forget about the gas station on Route 23. I never told anyone what I had seen. Who would believe me? But I still think about them sometimes. The visitors who came after midnight, the sounds they made, the way they looked at me through the glass, and I wonder if they are still there, still emerging from the forest, still standing in the parking lot, still waiting for someone to make the mistake of opening the door. I hope whoever works that night shift now follows the rules, because I know what happens when you do not. I know the sound they make when they think you might let them in. I moved to Mingo County, West Virginia, in the fall of 2017, with all the naive optimism of a 22-year-old who thought she could change the world. I had just graduated from Marshall University with a degree in elementary education, and I had chosen to teach in one of the poorest counties in the state because I believed that was where I could make the most difference. I wanted to help children who had been forgotten by the system. I wanted to be the kind of teacher who inspired kids to dream bigger than their circumstances. I had no idea what I was walking into. The town was called Delbarton, a small community nestled in the hills along the Tug Fork River. The population was barely 1,000 people, and most of them had lived there their entire lives. The elementary school where I worked was a squat brick building that had been constructed in the 1962 and never updated. There were cracks in the walls and water stains on the ceiling tiles and heating that worked only when it felt like it. The children were wonderful, poor and struggling and dealing with problems no kid should have to face, but wonderful nonetheless. They came to school hungry and I fed them. They came without proper clothes and I found donations. They came with stories of violence and addiction and neglect, and I listened without judgment and tried to provide a safe space for a few hours each day. I loved those kids. I still think about them sometimes. But there was one thing about that place that I could never understand. One story that the children told in whispers when they thought I was not listening. One name that made them go quiet and glance toward the windows like they expected something to be watching. Wolf Pen Branch. I first heard about it from a girl in my 3rd grade class named Emily. She was a quiet child, small for her age, with dark circles under her eyes that suggested she did not get enough sleep. She rarely spoke during class discussions, but her written work was exceptional. She had an imagination that seemed too big for her tiny body. One afternoon during free reading time, she approached my desk with a drawing she had made. It showed a creek surrounded by trees, with small figures standing on the banks. The figures were crude, drawn in dark crayon, but there was something unsettling about them. They had no faces, just blank ovals where features should have been. I asked her what she had drawn. She told me it was Wolf Pen Branch. She said there were children who lived there, children who had never been to school, children who only came out at night. I smiled and told her that was a very creative story. I assumed it was something she had heard from older kids or maybe seen in a movie. Children love ghost stories. They tell them on playgrounds and at sleepovers and around campfires. It was perfectly normal. But Emily did not smile back. She looked at me with those tired, knowing eyes and said it was not a story. She said the children were real. She said her grandmother had seen them when she was a little girl. She said they had always been there, living in the hollow near the creek, watching the town from the shadows. I thanked her for sharing her drawing and changed the subject. But something about the way she looked at me stayed with me for the rest of the day. She was not playing pretend. She believed every word she had said. Over the following weeks, I heard more about Wolf Pen Branch, not from Emily, but from other students. They mentioned it in passing during conversations I was not supposed to overhear. They drew pictures of the creek and the faceless children who lived there. One boy told me his father had forbidden him from going anywhere near that part of the county after dark. I asked my colleagues about it during lunch one day. The other teachers were older, local women who had been teaching at the school for decades. When I mentioned Wolfpen Branch, the conversation stopped cold. One of them, a veteran teacher named Mrs. Patterson, fixed me with a hard look and told me that some things were better left alone. She said the people in this county had lived alongside certain realities for generations. She said outsiders did not need to understand everything. I pressed her for details. I was curious now. What exactly were these children that everyone kept mentioning? Who were they? Where did they come from? She shook her head and returned to her lunch. The other teachers followed her lead. No one spoke to me for the rest of the period. I let it go. I had more important things to worry about than local superstitions, or so I told myself. Then the strange things started happening. My apartment was a small one-bedroom unit in a converted house on the outskirts of town. The rent was cheap and the landlord was nice enough, even if the plumbing was unreliable and the windows did not seal properly. I had chosen it because it was close to the school and I did not have to worry about a long commute. The first incident occurred on a Tuesday morning in late October. I walked out to my car and noticed something in the mud near the driver's side door. Footprints, small footprints, like those of a child. They led from the tree line at the edge of the property to my car and then circled it several times before disappearing back into the woods. I told myself it was probably kids from the neighborhood playing around. There were several families with young children living nearby. It was not unusual for them to cut through the property on their way to school, but the prints were strange. The toes seemed too long. The spacing between them suggested an odd gait, like whoever made them was walking on the balls of their feet rather than using their whole foot. And they had appeared overnight, which meant someone had been walking around my car in the dark. I shrugged it off and drove to work. The second incident happened a week later. I woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom and noticed something on my bedroom window. Handprints. Small handprints pressed against the glass from the outside. They were at least 5 feet off the ground, higher than any child standing on the porch could reach. I stared at them for a long moment, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I convinced myself there had to be a rational explanation. Maybe someone had stood on a ladder. Maybe they were old prints I had not noticed before. Maybe I was still half asleep and imagining things. I went back to bed and did not look at the window again until morning. The prints were still there in the daylight, small hands with fingers that seemed too thin and too long. I cleaned them off with glass cleaner and tried to forget about it. The third incident was the one that changed everything. It was a Friday night in early November. I had stayed late at school, grading papers, and did not get home until after dark. I made dinner, watched television, and went to bed around 11. I fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the long week. I woke to the sound of singing. It was coming from outside, faint at first, barely audible over the wind and the creaking of the old house. But as I lay there listening, it grew louder, clearer. It was a nursery rhyme. I did not recognize the melody. It was not one of the songs we taught in school, or anything I remembered from my own childhood. The tune was simple and repetitive, almost hypnotic, but the thing that made my blood run cold was the voices singing it. They sounded like children, but not quite. There was something off about them. They were too high-pitched in some places and too low in others, like voices that had been recorded and played back at the wrong speed. They had a weathered quality, like old recordings that had degraded over time. I got out of bed and walked to the window that overlooked the parking lot behind my apartment. They were standing there, 5 or 6 small figures arranged in a loose circle in the middle of the lot. They were holding hands, swaying gently back and forth, singing that strange song in unison. I could not see their faces. They were turned away from me, or maybe there was nothing to see. Just small bodies in ragged clothes, moving in perfect synchronization. I watched them for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. I was frozen, unable to move, unable to look away. The singing continued, that same melody repeating over and over, drilling into my brain. Then I did something stupid. I reached over and turned on my porch light. The singing stopped instantly. The figures stopped swaying. For a moment, nothing happened. They just stood there, motionless, like statues in the pale glow of the single bulb. Then they turned, all of them at once, all in perfect unison. Their heads rotated toward my window with a movement that was too smooth, too synchronized to be natural. I still could not see their faces clearly, but I could feel their eyes on me, feel their attention shift from their strange ritual to me. They dropped to all fours, and they ran, not toward me, away, toward the tree line at the edge of the property. But the way they moved was wrong, so terribly wrong. They scuttled across the asphalt like insects, their limbs bending at impossible angles, covering ground faster than any child should be able to move. They disappeared into the darkness of the woods in seconds. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, I found footprints all over the parking lot. Those same small prints with the elongated toes and strange spacing. They were everywhere, crisscrossing the asphalt in patterns that made no sense, and they all led back to the tree line, back toward the woods that bordered my property, back toward Wolfpen Branch. I called in sick that day. I spent hours researching the history of the area, searching for any information about children living in the woods, or unexplained disappearances, or anything that might explain what I had seen. I found almost nothing. A few vague references in old newspaper articles about strange sightings in the hollows. A mention in a county history book about families that had retreated into the wilderness during the Depression and never returned. Nothing concrete. Nothing that proved anything. I went to Mrs. Patterson's house that evening. I knocked on her door and told her what I had seen. I told her about the footprints and the handprints and the singing and the way they had moved when they ran. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she invited me inside and made me a cup of tea. She sat down across from me and told me what she knew. She said the children of Wolfpen Branch had been there for as long as anyone could remember. She said they were the descendants of families that had gone into the hollows generations ago and never come back out. They had lived in isolation so complete that they had become something else, something not quite human anymore. She said they were curious about the town, curious about the people who lived in houses and drove cars and sent their children to school. They would watch from the woods and sometimes venture closer, but they rarely caused harm. They were just watching, trying to understand a world they were no longer part of. I asked her why no one had ever tried to help them, to bring them back to civilization, to give them the chance at a normal life. She looked at me with something like pity. She said people had tried, decades ago. She said it had not ended well. She said the children did not want to be helped. They did not understand what help meant. They only knew the woods and the creek and the strange existence they had created for themselves in the darkness. She told me to leave Mingo County. She said I was a good teacher and a good person, but this place was not for me. She said the children had taken an interest in me, and that interest would only grow stronger the longer I stayed. I took her advice. I submitted my transfer request the following Monday. By January, I was teaching at a school in Huntington, 2 hours away from Wolfpen Branch. I never went back to Delbarton. I never drove past those woods again, but I still hear that song sometimes. Late at night, when the world is quiet and I am on the edge of sleep, I hear those voices, that strange, weathered chorus, singing a melody I do not recognize. I wake up and check my windows and find nothing, just empty glass and darkness beyond. I tell myself it is just a memory, just my brain replaying a trauma I never fully processed. I tell myself I am safe now, far from Wolfpen Branch, far from whatever lives in those hollows. But sometimes I wonder if distance matters to them. Sometimes I wonder if they remember me the way I remember them. And sometimes, on mornings after rain, I find small footprints in the mud outside my window. I try not to think about what that means. My brother Danny and I grew up in a small town called Appalachia in southwestern Virginia. Yes, that is actually the name of the town. Our parents thought it was funny when we were kids. A town called Appalachia in the heart of Appalachia. It was not funny to us. It was just home, a collection of worn-out houses and shuttered businesses clinging to the side of a mountain that had been hollowed out by coal mining for over a century. By the time we were teenagers in the early 2000s, most of the mines had closed. The coal industry was dying and taking our town with it. Half the storefronts on Main Street were empty. Half the families we knew had moved away looking for work. Those who stayed did so because they had nowhere else to go, or because the mountains were in their blood and they could not imagine living anywhere else. Danny and I were bored constantly. There was nothing to do in Appalachia except get into trouble. No movie theater, no mall, no arcade, just empty streets and abandoned buildings and miles of forest stretching in every direction. We made our own entertainment, which usually meant exploring places we were not supposed to go. The abandoned mines were our favorite. I know how stupid that sounds now. I know we could have been killed 100 different ways. Cave-ins, toxic gases, flooded shafts, unstable ground. Our parents would have murdered us if they had known what we were doing. But we were 15 and 16 years old, convinced of our own immortality, and the mines were irresistible. They were dark and forbidden and full of history. Every time we went into one, we felt like explorers discovering a lost world. Most of the old shafts had been sealed by the mining companies or collapsed on their own over the decades. But some had openings, gaps in the barricades or erosion that had created new entrances. We would squeeze through these holes and venture into the darkness with flashlights and rope, mapping the tunnels, collecting artifacts, pretending we were the first people to walk those passages in 50 years. We explored maybe a dozen mines over the course of 2 summers. Each one was different. Some were small, barely more than test shafts that dead-ended after a few hundred feet. Others went deep into the mountain, branching into networks of tunnels that seemed to go on forever. We learned to read the signs of danger: water seeping through the walls, air that smelled wrong, ceiling beams that had rotted through. We were careful. We were smart. We thought we knew what we were doing. Then we found the mine in the ravine. It was July of 2003. Danny had just turned 17, and I was a few months shy of 16. We had been hiking through a section of forest we had never explored before, following an old logging road that had been reclaimed by vegetation. The road led us down into a ravine where a creek trickled over mossy rocks, and the canopy was so thick that barely any sunlight reached the ground. That is where we saw the entrance. It was hidden behind a curtain of kudzu and brambles, almost invisible unless you knew what you were looking for. The opening was larger than any we had found before, maybe 8 feet high and 6 feet wide. Wide enough that we could walk in standing upright instead of crawling on our hands and knees. We looked at each other with the excitement that only teenage boys can muster for something dangerous and forbidden. We had found something new, something no one had told us about, something that felt like it belonged to us. We came back the next day with supplies: flashlights, extra batteries, rope, water, a first aid kit. We told our mom we were going fishing at the reservoir. She did not question it. She was used to us disappearing for hours at a time during the summer. The entrance was exactly as we had left it. We pushed through the overgrowth and stepped into the darkness. The first 100 yards were easy. The tunnel was high and wide, the floor relatively flat. Our flashlight beams cut through the blackness and revealed walls of gray stone marked by the pickaxes and drilling equipment of miners long dead. The air was cool and damp, a relief from the summer heat outside. We moved deeper. The tunnel began to slope downward, descending into the mountain at a gentle angle. We passed old support beams, some still standing and some collapsed into piles of rotted wood. We found rusted equipment, a broken lantern, a lunch pail that crumbled when Danny touched it. About a quarter mile in, Danny stopped. He grabbed my arm and pointed his flashlight at the wall to our right. At first, I did not understand what I was looking at. The wall was covered in marks, hundreds of them, thousands maybe. They ran from the floor to as high as we could reach, covering every inch of stone in that section of tunnel. I stepped closer and my stomach dropped. They were scratches, fingernail scratches. I could see the individual grooves where nails had dragged across the rock. Some were shallow, barely visible. Others were deep, carved by someone applying tremendous pressure over and over again. Some were old, worn smooth by time and moisture. Others looked fresh, recent. Danny and I looked at each other. Neither of us spoke. We both knew what we were seeing. Someone had been scratching at this wall. Someone had been trying to get through the rock with their bare hands. I wanted to leave. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and run back to the daylight. But Danny was already moving deeper into the tunnel, his flashlight sweeping across the walls. The scratches continued. They were everywhere now, both walls, the ceiling, even the floor in places. We walked another 100 feet in silence. Then we heard the breathing. It was faint at first, so quiet I almost convinced myself it was an echo of our own respiration or the sound of air moving through the tunnel. But as we stood there, frozen, listening, it grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from somewhere ahead of us, deeper in the mine. The breathing was wrong, too deep, too wet, like something with damaged lungs struggling to pull air through fluid. It had a rhythm to it, slow and steady, but the sound itself was animal, primal. Danny turned off his flashlight. I did the same. We stood in absolute darkness, listening. The breathing continued, steady, patient. Then we heard movement. something shifting in the darkness ahead, something large. Danny grabbed my hand and squeezed. I understood. We needed to leave. We needed to leave now. We turned and ran. I do not know how we made it out without falling or crashing into the walls. We ran blind through the darkness, our flashlights forgotten, our hands trailing along the stone to keep ourselves oriented. The tunnel seemed longer than it had on the way in. The slope seemed steeper. Every second I expected something to grab me from behind, to pull me back into the depths. Then I saw light. The entrance appeared ahead of us, a rectangle of green and gold against the blackness. We burst through the kudzu and collapsed on the creek bank, gasping for air, our hearts pounding so hard I could hear Danny's pulse mixing with my own. We lay there for several minutes, too terrified to move. Then Danny sat up and looked back at the entrance. I followed his gaze. Something was standing just inside the shadow. It was shaped like a person, roughly. It had 2 arms and 2 legs and what might have been a head, but the proportions were wrong. The limbs were too long, the body was too thin. It was hunched over, bent at angles that did not look natural, swaying slightly like it was having trouble staying upright. I could not see its face. The darkness inside the mine was too complete, but I could feel it looking at us, feel its attention like a physical weight pressing against my chest. It made a sound, that same wet, labored breathing we had heard in the tunnel, but now it was louder, more urgent, like it was excited. I scrambled to my feet and grabbed Danny, and we ran. We ran through the ravine and up the logging road and through the forest until we reached the paved road that led back to town. We did not stop until we were standing in our own backyard, bent over and gasping, and covered in scratches from the brambles we had crashed through. We never told anyone what we saw. Who would have believed us? We were just kids. Stupid kids who had been exploring places they should not have been. If we told our parents, we would have been grounded for the rest of the summer and probably longer. If we told our friends, they would have laughed at us or called us liars. So we kept it to ourselves. We never went back to that mine. We never even went back to that part of the forest. We stopped exploring abandoned shafts entirely after that summer. The thrill was gone, replaced by a cold dread that settled into our bones and never fully left. Years passed. I graduated high school and moved away for college. Danny stayed in Appalachia, got a job at a warehouse, married his high school girlfriend. We drifted apart the way siblings sometimes do when their lives take different paths. I did not think about the mine for a long time. I buried the memory deep and tried to convince myself it had been a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by fear and darkness, something my teenage brain had invented to explain sounds and shadows that had perfectly rational explanations. Then Danny called me in the fall of 2019. He was drunk. I could hear it in his voice. He told me he had been back to the ravine. He told me he had found the mine again after all these years. He told me the entrance had been sealed. Someone had poured concrete over the opening and welded a steel grate across it. But that was not why he called. He called because of what was written on the concrete. Someone had spray painted a message across the seal, just 2 words in dripping red letters. Still here. Danny asked me if I remembered what we saw that day. I told him I remembered. He asked me what I thought it meant. I told him I did not know. We talked for another hour, going over the details of that summer, trying to make sense of something that defied sense. By the end of the call, we had not reached any conclusions. We just had more questions. Danny died the following spring. Car accident on a mountain road. They said he lost control on a curve. They said he might have been drinking. The funeral was small, just family and a few friends from town. I went back to the ravine after the service. I do not know why. Some need for closure maybe. Some compulsion I could not explain. The mine entrance was exactly as Danny had described. Concrete seal, steel grate, red letters fading in the weather. But there was something else. Something Danny had not mentioned. Scratches. Fresh scratches on the inside of the steel grate. Long grooves where something had been clawing at the metal, trying to get out. I stood there for a long time, staring at those marks, listening to the silence of the ravine. Then I heard it. Faint, distant, coming from somewhere behind the concrete seal. Breathing, deep and wet and patient. I left, and I have not been back since. I sold my share of our parents' house after they passed. I have no reason to return to Appalachia now. No family left, no connections. Nothing tying me to those mountains, except memories I would rather forget. But I still think about that mine sometimes. I still wonder what we saw standing in the entrance that day. I still wonder how long it had been down there, how long it had been scratching at the walls, how long it had been breathing in the darkness. And I wonder if the seal will hold. I wonder if concrete and steel are enough to keep something like that contained. I wonder if someday, someone will find a new opening, a crack in the mountain, a gap in the barrier. And I wonder what will happen when whatever lives in that mine finally finds its way out. Some secrets are better left buried, but sometimes the buried things do not stay buried. Sometimes they scratch their way back to the surface. I spent 42 years working for the same insurance company in Atlanta. I started as a claims adjuster right out of college and worked my way up to regional vice president before I finally decided I had had enough. The corporate world had given me a comfortable life, a good pension, and enough savings to do whatever I wanted in retirement. What I wanted was solitude. I had been dreaming about a cabin in the mountains for as long as I could remember, a place far from the noise and traffic and endless meetings that had consumed my adult life. A place where I could read books and fish and listen to the wind through the trees without another human being demanding my attention. My wife had passed away 3 years earlier, and our children had long since moved to opposite coasts. There was nothing keeping me in Atlanta anymore. I found the property through a real estate agent who specialized in remote mountain land, 15 acres in the Smoky Mountains of eastern Tennessee, accessible only by a single dirt road that wound through 6 miles of national forest. The nearest neighbor was over 3 miles away. The nearest town was 45 minutes of bad roads in any direction. The cabin itself was modest. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a combined kitchen and living area with a stone fireplace. It had been built in the 1972 by a man who used it as a hunting lodge until he passed away in 2015. His children had no interest in maintaining a property so far from civilization, so they put it on the market and waited for someone crazy enough to buy it. I was that someone. I closed on the property in March of 2021 and moved in the following month. The first few weeks were everything I had hoped for. I unpacked my books and fishing gear and settled into a routine that revolved entirely around my own desires. I woke when I wanted. I ate when I was hungry. I hiked the trails that wound through the forest and fished in the streams that cut through the valleys below my property. For the first time in decades, I felt at peace. The nearest town was a place called Cosby, a small community of maybe 100 permanent residents that swelled with tourists during the summer months. I would drive in once a week for groceries and supplies, nodding politely at the locals who seemed to recognize that I was not interested in conversation. They left me alone, and I left them alone, and we all seemed content with that arrangement. Summer faded into fall. The leaves turned brilliant shades of orange and red. The nights grew cold enough that I started keeping the fireplace burning after sunset. I spent my evenings in an armchair by the fire, reading novels I had never had time for during my working years. It was during one of those evenings that I first saw her. I had stepped out onto the deck to smoke a cigar and watch the sunset. It was a clear evening, the sky painted in shades of pink and purple, the mountains stretching away in layers of deepening blue. The air smelled like wood smoke and dying leaves. I noticed movement at the edge of my vision. I turned and looked toward the tree line, maybe 50 yards from the cabin. Someone was standing there, half hidden in the shadow between 2 large oak trees. It was a woman. She was thin, too thin. Her body had an angular, malnourished quality that made me think she had not eaten properly in a very long time. She was wearing what looked like a nightgown, white fabric stained gray with dirt and age. It hung loosely on her frame, torn in places, exposing skin that was pale and grimy. Her hair was long and dark and matted into tangles that hung past her shoulders. I could not see her face clearly at that distance, but I could feel her eyes on me. She was watching me with an intensity that made the hair on my arms stand up. I called out to her. I asked if she was okay. I asked if she needed help. I asked if she was lost. She did not respond. She did not move. She just stood there, watching, as motionless as the trees around her. I set down my cigar and walked toward the edge of the deck. I was going to go to her. I was going to find out who she was and what she needed. No one should be out in the woods dressed like that, especially not with the temperatures dropping the way they were. I went inside to grab my phone, thinking I might need to call for medical assistance. When I came back out 30 seconds later, she was gone. I walked to the tree line and looked around. No sign of her. No footprints in the soft ground, no broken branches or trampled undergrowth. It was like she had simply vanished. I told myself I had imagined it, a trick of the fading light, a shadow my brain had interpreted as a human figure. I was 67 years old and living alone in the wilderness. It was not unreasonable to think my mind might play tricks on me occasionally. But she came back the next night. Same time, same place, same motionless watching. This time I did not call out. I just stood on my deck and watched her watch me. The standoff lasted maybe 20 minutes before the darkness became complete, and I could no longer see the tree line clearly. When I turned on my porch light, she was gone. The pattern continued for a week. Every evening at dusk, she would appear at the edge of the forest. Every evening she would stand there watching until full darkness fell. Every evening she would vanish before I could reach her. I called the sheriff on the 8th day. A deputy drove out the following afternoon. He was a young man, maybe 30, with the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much in a county with too many problems. I told him what I had been seeing. A woman in the woods, watching my cabin every night, never responding when I called out to her. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he told me about the generational isolates. He said there were families in these mountains who had lived apart from society for generations. They had settled in the remote hollows and valleys during the 1800s and never integrated with the outside world. They were not dangerous, he said, but they were different. They lived by their own rules and their own customs. Some of them had never seen a doctor or been to school. Some of them had never spoken to anyone outside their own family group. He said they were curious about newcomers. They would watch from a distance, trying to understand these strangers who built houses on land their ancestors had roamed freely. Most of the time they kept their distance. Most of the time they eventually lost interest and moved on. I asked him what I should do. He told me to lock my doors at night. He told me not to engage with her or try to approach her. He told me to call if anything changed, but otherwise to just let her be. He left, and I felt slightly better. There was a rational explanation. She was not a ghost or a hallucination. She was just a woman from an isolated community who was curious about the stranger living in her territory. But the comfort did not last. She started coming closer. It was gradual at first. Instead of standing at the tree line, she would stand at the edge of my yard, then halfway across the yard, then at the bottom of the steps that led up to my deck. I would watch her through the window, my heart pounding, my phone clutched in my hand. She never tried to climb the steps. She never tried to approach the door. She would just stand there, watching, until the darkness swallowed her and she disappeared. Then came the night I found the footprints. I woke around 3 in the morning with the unsettling feeling that something was wrong. I lay in bed, listening, but heard nothing. No sounds from outside, no animals moving through the brush, just silence. I got up and walked to my bedroom window. The moon was bright, casting silver light across the yard. I could see the tree line clearly, the deck, the steps, and the woman. She was standing directly outside my window, maybe 5 feet from the glass. Her face was turned toward me, but her features were still obscured by the tangled curtain of her hair. She was standing perfectly still, her arms hanging at her sides, her bare feet planted on the wooden planks of my porch. I stumbled backward and fell. By the time I scrambled to my feet and looked again, she was gone. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in my chair by the dead fireplace with every light in the cabin burning, waiting for dawn. In the morning, I went outside to check the porch. There were footprints in the thin layer of frost that had formed overnight, small, bare feet. They led from the steps to my bedroom window and back again. She had been standing there for a while, long enough for the frost to form around her feet. I called the sheriff again. The same deputy came out and looked at the footprints. He took photographs and made notes, but I could tell from his expression that there was nothing he could do. She had not broken any laws. She had not threatened me. She was just standing on my property, and in a county this remote, that was barely worth mentioning. He told me I could set up cameras. He told me I could get a dog. He told me I could leave if I felt unsafe. I did not want to leave. This was my retirement. This was the life I had planned for. I was not going to be driven out of my own home by some feral woman who liked to watch me through windows. But I started sleeping with a loaded shotgun beside my bed. The watching continued. Every night at dusk. Every night she came a little closer. Every morning I found new footprints. On the porch. By the windows. Once, I found them on the roof. I set up cameras like the deputy suggested, motion-activated trail cameras positioned around the property. I checked the footage every morning, hoping to finally get a clear image of her face. The cameras captured nothing. The motion sensors never triggered. It was like she did not exist to the technology, even though I could see her plainly with my own eyes. Last week, I found something that changed everything. I was checking the perimeter of the cabin, looking for new footprints, when I noticed something half buried in the leaves near the tree line. I brushed away the debris and found a photograph. It was old, faded, black and white. The edges were worn, and the surface was cracked. It showed a family standing in front of a cabin. A man, a woman, 3 children. They were dressed in clothes from another era, maybe the 1940 seconds or 1950 seconds. Behind them, I could see the distinctive stone chimney and wooden siding. It was my cabin. The woman in the photograph looked young and healthy. She was smiling at the camera, her arm around one of the children. But I recognized her. The shape of her face, the way she held herself, the long dark hair. It was her, the woman who watched from the trees. But that was impossible. If this photograph was from the 1940 seconds, she would be over 80 years old by now. The woman I had been seeing looked ageless, timeless, neither young nor old. I do not know what to do with this information. I do not know what it means. I still see her every night. She still watches. She still comes closer. And now, sometimes, I see others standing with her. Small figures, children maybe, standing at the tree line, watching with her. I think they want something. I think they have been waiting for someone to come back to this cabin for a very long time. And I think they are getting impatient. I should leave. I know that. Every rational part of my brain is screaming at me to pack my things and drive away and never look back. But this is my home now. This is the life I chose. And some part of me needs to know what happens next. Some part of me needs to understand. Even if understanding is the last thing I ever do. I have been a nurse at Pikeville Medical Center for 11 years. I work the night shift in the emergency room because I am a single mother, and the differential pay helps me cover childcare during the day. It is exhausting work. 12-hour shifts from 7 in the evening until 7 in the morning, dealing with everything from car accidents to overdoses to elderly patients who have fallen and cannot get up. I have seen things that would give most people nightmares. Blood and bone and death in all its forms. After a decade in the ER, I thought I was immune to fear. I was wrong. The night it happened was a Thursday in late October of 2022. I had worked a brutal shift, 2 cardiac arrests, a gunshot wound, and a teenager who had wrapped his car around a tree on Route 23. By the time I clocked out at 7:15, I was running on fumes. All I wanted was to get home, kiss my daughter goodbye before my mother took her to school, and collapse into bed. The drive from Pikeville to my house in Elkhorn City takes about 40 minutes on a good day. Most of that is on Route 119, a winding 2-lane highway that cuts through the mountains of eastern Kentucky. During the day, it is a scenic drive through some of the most beautiful country in the state. At night, it is something else entirely. Dark forests press in from both sides. The curves are treacherous. Cell service is spotty at best. I have made that drive hundreds of times. I know every curve and straightaway. I know where the deer like to cross and where the fog tends to gather. I know to slow down near Shelby Gap because the road dips and water pools there after rain. I thought I knew everything about that road. I was about 20 minutes into the drive when I saw him. It was just past midnight. The road was empty. No headlights ahead of me. No tail lights in my rearview mirror. Just my car and the darkness and the pale strip of asphalt illuminated by my headlights. He was standing on the shoulder of the road, maybe 50 yards ahead. At first I thought it was a deer. The shape was wrong for a person. Too still, too pale, but as I got closer, I realized it was a man. He was thin, impossibly thin. His clothes hung on his frame like they had been made for someone twice his size. He was wearing a button-down shirt and dark trousers, the kind of outfit a man might wear to church. But the clothes were wrong. The cut was old-fashioned. The fabric was faded and stained. They looked like something from my grandfather's closet. He was not holding a sign. He was not waving for help. He was just standing there, facing the road, perfectly still, like he was waiting for someone specific. Every instinct told me to keep driving. I was a woman alone on an empty road in the middle of the night. Stopping for a stranger was dangerous under the best circumstances. But I am a nurse. I have spent my career helping people in crisis. I could not just drive past someone who might need assistance. I slowed down and pulled onto the shoulder about 10 feet behind him. I did not get out. I just rolled down my window and called out. I asked if he was okay. I asked if he needed help. I asked if his car had broken down. He did not answer. He did not even turn to look at me. He just stood there, facing forward, like he had not heard me at all. I should have driven away then. I know that now. But something made me stay. Some combination of exhaustion and professional obligation that overrode my common sense. I called out again, louder this time. I told him I was a nurse. I told him I could help if he was hurt. Slowly, he turned. I could not see his face clearly. The light from my headlights was behind him, casting his features in shadow, but I could see enough to know something was wrong. His movements were too slow, too deliberate, like a marionette being controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. He walked toward my car. Not the hesitant approach of someone who was injured or confused. A steady, purposeful stride that covered the distance between us in seconds. He reached my passenger door and stopped. I should have locked the doors. I should have driven away. But I just sat there, frozen, as he opened the door and got in. The smell hit me immediately. It was organic, rotten, like meat that had been left in the sun for days. It filled the car instantly, thick and cloying, coating the back of my throat and making my eyes water. I gagged and reached for the window control, desperate for fresh air. He sat perfectly still in the passenger seat, facing forward. Now that he was inside the car, I could see him more clearly. His skin had a grayish tint, like old paper. His hair was thin and patchy, clinging to a scalp that seemed too visible beneath. His hands were folded in his lap, and I noticed his fingernails. They were long and black, curved like claws, caked with dirt that had accumulated over what looked like months. I asked where he was going. He did not answer. He just raised one of those terrible hands and pointed down the road. I do not know why I started driving. Some part of my brain had shut down, replaced by an autopilot that simply followed the path of least resistance. He wanted to go down the road. I would take him down the road. Then this would be over. I accelerated slowly, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The smell in the car was overwhelming. I breathed through my mouth and tried not to think about what could cause a human being to smell like that. We drove in silence for the first few miles. He sat motionless beside me, that pointing hand slowly lowering back to his lap. I kept glancing at him in my peripheral vision, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. His clothes, his skin, his stillness. Then he started humming. It was low and tuneless, a droning sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. Not a melody I recognized. Not music at all, really. Just a repetitive sequence of notes that went on without variation. The sound made my skin crawl. It felt wrong in a way I could not articulate, like hearing a voice speaking backwards or watching a video played in reverse. Something that violated the natural order of things. I tried to make conversation. I asked his name. I asked where he lived. I asked if there was someone I could call for him. He did not respond to any of my questions. He just kept humming. That same pattern of notes, over and over, filling the car with sound that was not quite music. I looked over at him more directly. The interior light from my dashboard illuminated his face in pale green. His eyes were open, wide open, but they were not looking at the road or at me or at anything I could identify. They were staring straight ahead, fixed on something I could not see. The pupils were dilated to the point of nearly swallowing the iris. Black pools in a gray face. I looked at his hands again. The dirt under those long black nails was not just dirt. Some of it was darker, organic. It looked like soil that had been mixed with something else. Something that had once been alive. I needed to get out of this car. I saw a gas station ahead, its lights glowing in the darkness like a beacon. A speedway, open 24 hours. I recognized it. I had stopped there before on my way home from work. I pulled into the parking lot and stopped at a pump. I told him I needed fuel. I told him I would be right back. He did not respond. He just sat there, humming, staring at nothing. I got out of the car and walked as calmly as I could toward the store. Every step was an effort. Every instinct screamed at me to run. But some part of me knew that running would be a mistake. That showing fear would trigger something I did not want to trigger. I reached the door and pulled it open and stepped inside. The clerk was a young man, maybe 20, with acne and a bored expression. I walked up to the counter and asked him to call the police. I told him there was a man in my car. I told him something was wrong with him. I told him I was afraid. The clerk's expression changed. The boredom vanished, replaced by something that looked like recognition. He picked up the phone and dialed, but his eyes were on the parking lot behind me. I turned and looked. My car was empty. The passenger door was standing open, but the man was gone. I had not heard him leave. I had not seen him move. He had simply vanished. I stood there staring for a long moment, my heart pounding, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. The clerk hung up the phone. He told me the police were on their way. Then he said something that made my blood freeze. He said I was not the first person to pick up a hitchhiker on that stretch of Route 119. He said people came in every few months with the same story. A man on the side of the road, old-fashioned clothes, a terrible smell, humming that got under your skin and would not let go. He said the smart ones did not stop anymore. He said there was a reason that stretch of road was empty at night. He said people who lived around here knew better than to pick up strangers after dark. I asked him who the man was, what he was. The clerk shrugged. He said there were stories, but no one knew for sure. Some people said he was the ghost of a man who had been killed on that road decades ago. Others said he was something older, something that had always been in these mountains, wearing different faces at different times. He said the only thing everyone agreed on was that you should not let him in your car. He said people who did sometimes made it out okay, others were not so lucky. I asked what happened to the unlucky ones. He did not answer. He just looked at me with an expression that suggested he had already said more than he should. The police arrived and took my statement. They searched the area but found nothing. No footprints. No physical evidence that anyone had been in my car except me. They told me I was probably exhausted from my shift. They told me the mind could play tricks when you were tired. I did not argue. I just wanted to go home. I made my mother stay with me that night. I could not bear to be alone. I took a shower so hot it nearly scalded my skin, trying to wash away the smell that seemed to cling to me. I slept with every light in the house burning. I still drive Route 119. I do not have a choice. It is the only practical route between my work and my home, but I do not stop anymore. Not for anything, not for anyone. And sometimes, late at night, when the road is empty and the darkness presses in from both sides, I see a figure standing on the shoulder up ahead, thin and pale, perfectly still, waiting. I do not slow down. I do not look. I just grip the wheel and press the accelerator and pray that whatever is standing there does not follow. Because I know now what the clerk meant. I know what happens to the unlucky ones. I can still smell it sometimes. That rotten, organic stench that filled my car and coated my throat and would not wash away no matter how hard I scrubbed. And I can still hear that humming. Late at night, when the house is quiet and I am trying to fall asleep, I hear it, low and tuneless, coming from somewhere I cannot identify, getting closer. The house I grew up in was built by my great-grandfather in 1923. It sat on a hillside in Lecher County, Kentucky, a weathered two-story farmhouse that had sheltered 4 generations of my family. The floors creaked in familiar patterns. The walls held memories in their plaster and lathe. Every corner of that house was known to me, mapped in my mind from years of childhood exploration, except for the storm cellar. The cellar was accessible through a heavy wooden door in the floor of our mudroom. The door was always locked with a padlock that my father kept the key to. When I was young, maybe 5 or 6, I asked him why we never used it. He told me the stairs were rotted. He told me the ceiling was unstable. He told me it was dangerous and I should never go down there. I believed him. Children believe their parents. It never occurred to me to question why a dangerous cellar needed to be locked from the outside rather than sealed permanently. It never occurred to me to wonder why my father checked that padlock every night before bed, testing it to make sure it was secure. I was 14 years old when I discovered the truth. It was a Thursday in late September of 1998. A massive storm system had moved into the region, bringing torrential rain and winds that bent the trees nearly horizontal. School had been canceled. My parents both worked at the hospital in Whitesburg, and they had left before dawn for their shifts. My older sister was away at college. I was alone in the house. The power went out around noon. I was not worried at first. We lost power regularly during storms, and I knew where the candles and flashlights were kept. I gathered supplies and settled into the living room with a book, listening to the rain hammer against the windows and the thunder roll across the mountains. Then I heard the voices. At first I thought it was the storm. Wind can make strange sounds when it moves through old houses. It can whistle through gaps in the walls and moan around corners. I told myself that was what I was hearing, just the wind. But the sound continued even when the wind died down. It was coming from somewhere inside the house, somewhere below. I set down my book and listened. The sound was faint, barely audible above the rain, but it was definitely there. Voices, multiple voices, overlapping and intertwining, speaking words I could not quite make out. The tone was urgent, pleading, like people who desperately needed to be heard. I walked into the mudroom and stood in front of the cellar door. The voices were louder here. I could hear them clearly now, rising up through the wooden planks. They were not speaking English, not any language I recognized, but there was a cadence to the sounds, a rhythm that suggested meaning. These were not random noises. Someone was trying to communicate. I knelt down and pressed my ear against the door. The whispering intensified. I could feel it vibrating through the wood, a chorus of desperate voices that seemed to sense my presence. They were calling to me, begging me. For what? I did not know. I knew I should not open that door. My father had forbidden it. He had made me promise, years ago, that I would never try to go into the cellar. But I was 14 years old and alone and frightened, and the voices would not stop. I went to my parents' bedroom and found the key in my mother's dresser, hidden in a jewelry box beneath a tangle of necklaces she never wore. I had not known it was there. I must have found it through some instinct, some memory of seeing her put it away when I was very young. I returned to the cellar door and inserted the key into the padlock. The voices fell silent. The sudden quiet was almost worse than the whispering. It felt expectant, patient, like whatever was down there knew I was coming and was waiting. I removed the padlock and pulled open the door. The smell hit me immediately. It was thick and organic, rising from the darkness below in waves. Damp earth, mold, and something else beneath those familiar scents. Something animal, something rotten. It coated the back of my throat and made my eyes water. I pointed my flashlight down the stairs. They looked solid enough, despite what my father had told me. Wooden steps descending into blackness, worn smooth by decades of use. I tested the first one with my foot. It held my weight without creaking. I started down. The cellar was exactly what I expected. A rectangular room with stone walls and a dirt floor, maybe 15 feet by 20. Shelves lined the walls, holding dusty mason jars that might once have contained preserves. Old tools hung from hooks. A broken rocking chair sat in one corner. Everything was covered in a thick layer of grime and cobwebs. But that was not what made me stop breathing. At the far end of the cellar, someone had dug a tunnel. The opening was maybe 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, carved into the stone foundation and continuing into the earth beyond. The edges were rough, showing the marks of hand tools, pickaxes or shovels. Someone had spent a long time creating this passage. The tunnel extended farther than my flashlight beam could reach. It sloped downward at a gentle angle, disappearing into darkness that seemed to swallow the light. The whispering started again. It was coming from inside the tunnel. I stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The voices were clearer now, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all speaking at once in that language I did not understand. They rose and fell in waves, sometimes urgent, sometimes soothing, always insistent. I took a step toward the tunnel. Some part of my brain was screaming at me to run, to climb back up those stairs and lock the door and pretend I had never seen any of this. But another part, a stronger part, was drawn toward those voices. They needed me. They were calling to me. I had to know what they wanted. I reached the entrance to the tunnel and shined my flashlight inside. The walls were covered in scratches. Not tool marks, scratches, fingernail scratches, thousands of them, covering every inch of the tunnel walls as far as I could see. Some were old, worn smooth by time. Others looked fresh, recent. The whispering grew louder, more urgent. The voices were excited now, rising in pitch and volume, overlapping until they became a single droning hum that seemed to vibrate in my skull. I saw something move in the darkness ahead, just a flicker, a shifting of shadows that might have been a trick of the light. but I knew it was not. Something was in that tunnel. Something was coming toward me. I ran. I do not remember climbing the stairs. I do not remember slamming the door shut and replacing the padlock. I only remember sitting in the mudroom with my back against the wall, gasping for breath, listening to the voices below rise to a crescendo and then slowly fade into silence. My parents came home that evening. I said nothing about what I had found. How could I? What would I say? I spent the next 4 years living in that house, walking past that cellar door every day, knowing what was beneath it, knowing and staying silent. I left for college when I was 18. I chose a school in Ohio, as far from Lecher County as I could reasonably go. I told myself it was for the educational opportunities. The truth was simpler. I needed to get away from that house, from that door, from the voices that I could still hear sometimes, late at night, when the world was quiet. I did not go back for 10 years. My father called me in the spring of 2012. My mother had passed away unexpectedly. A stroke. She was 63 years old. I drove down for the funeral and stayed to help him sort through her things. On my last night there, I asked him about the cellar. We were sitting on the porch, drinking whiskey, and watching the stars emerge over the mountains. I had been waiting for the right moment all week. I had rehearsed what I was going to say, but when the words finally came out, they were simpler than I had planned. I asked him what was in the tunnel. His face went white. His hand trembled so badly that whiskey sloshed over the rim of his glass. For a long moment, he did not speak. Then he told me to never talk about it again. He told me there were things in this world that were better left sealed. He told me the tunnel had been there when his grandfather built the house, that his grandfather had found it and walled it up and sworn his family to secrecy, that every generation since had kept that secret, kept the door locked, kept the voices contained. I asked him what was down there, who had dug the tunnel, where it led. He shook his head. He said he did not know. He said no one knew. He said his grandfather had gone into the tunnel once, 50 years ago, and when he came back out, he never spoke another word. He lived for another 20 years, mute and hollow-eyed, refusing to write down what he had seen. I asked my father if he had ever opened the door. He looked at me with eyes that held decades of fear. He said he had opened it once, when he was 16, just like me. He said he had heard the voices and gone down the stairs and seen the tunnel, but he had gone farther than I had. He said he walked into the tunnel for about 100 feet. He said the scratches on the walls got deeper the farther he went. He said there were other things in the tunnel too, things he would not describe, things that made him turn around and run. He said when he reached the cellar, there was something standing at the bottom of the stairs, something that had followed him out of the darkness. He did not see it clearly, just a shape, a suggestion of limbs and eyes in the dim light. He ran up the stairs and slammed the door, and the thing did not follow. But he heard it. For weeks afterward, he heard it moving around in the cellar, scratching at the door, whispering in that language that was not language. Eventually it stopped. Eventually it went back into the tunnel, but he never forgot what he had almost let out. He made me promise to never open that door again. He made me promise to keep the secret, just like every generation before us. He made me promise to pass the warning on to my own children someday. He promised. My father passed away 3 years later. Heart attack. I inherited the house, but I could not bring myself to live there. I could not bring myself to sell it either. Whoever bought it might not understand. They might open the door. They might go down the stairs. So the house sits empty now, locked and abandoned on its hillside in Lecher County. I pay the taxes every year. I make sure the roof does not leak and the windows do not break. And I make sure the padlock on the cellar door is always secure. I went back once, a few years ago. I stood in the mudroom and pressed my ear against the wooden planks, just like I had when I was 14. The voices are still there, fainter now, more distant, but still calling, still pleading, still waiting for someone to open the door and come down the stairs. I do not know what my great-grandfather found when he built that house. I do not know who dug the tunnel, or where it leads, or what waits in the darkness beyond my flashlight beam. I do not know why the voices call, or what they want, or what would happen if someone answered. Some questions do not have answers. Some doors are locked for a reason. Some secrets are meant to be kept. I have a daughter now. She is 12 years old. Someday I will have to tell her about the house in Lecher County. Someday I will have to pass on the warning and make her promise, just like my father made me promise. but not yet. For now, I let her believe the world is safe and rational and fully understood. I let her believe there are no dark places where voices whisper and scratch marks cover the walls. I let her be innocent for a little while longer, because once you know what is in the cellar, you can never unknow it. And once you hear the voices, they never truly stop. I have been a wildlife photographer for 15 years. My work has taken me to some of the most remote and beautiful places on Earth. I have photographed grizzly bears in Alaska and wolves in Yellowstone and jaguars in the Amazon. I have spent weeks alone in the wilderness, sleeping in tents and eating freeze-dried food, waiting for the perfect shot. I thought I understood what solitude meant. I thought I understood what wild places could hide. I was wrong. In the fall of 2019, I received a grant from the National Geographic Society to document the recovery of wildlife populations in the southern Appalachian Mountains. Decades of conservation efforts had brought back species that had been nearly wiped out by hunting and habitat loss. Black bears were thriving. Elk had been successfully reintroduced. There were even rumors of mountain lion sightings in remote areas where they had not been seen in a century. I chose to focus my work on a section of the Jefferson National Forest in southwestern Virginia. It was one of the most isolated areas in the eastern United States, accessible only by logging roads that had been abandoned for decades. The Forest Service had warned me that cell coverage was non-existent and that I should not expect to see another human being for the duration of my project. That was exactly what I wanted. I set up a base camp in a small clearing about 6 miles from the nearest maintained road. From there, I deployed trail cameras throughout the surrounding forest, positioning them near game trails and water sources, where animals were likely to congregate. The cameras were motion-activated and equipped with infrared sensors for night photography. They would capture whatever passed by, day or night, without requiring my presence. The first week produced exactly what I expected: deer, turkeys, a family of raccoons investigating one of my camera stations, a magnificent black bear who seemed to pose for his portrait before ambling off into the undergrowth. I was pleased with the results and excited about the project ahead. Then I collected the memory cards from my most remote camera. I had placed it near a creek about 2 miles from my camp, in an area so overgrown that I had to use a machete to clear a path. The camera was positioned to capture animals coming to drink, and based on the tracks I had seen in the mud, I expected images of bears and possibly elk. What I found was something else entirely. The first images were normal: deer at dusk, an owl at midnight, a opossum in the early morning hours. But then the timestamps jumped to 3:17 a.m. and everything changed. The image showed people, dozens of them, moving through the forest in single file. They were naked, their bodies covered in mud and what looked like dried blood. Their faces were turned away from the camera, but I could see enough to know they were not hikers or campers or anyone who belonged in these woods. They walked with a strange, shuffling gait, their arms hanging loose at their sides, their heads bowed as if in prayer or trance. I stared at the image for a long time, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then I scrolled to the next photograph. More people, the same procession, continuing past the camera, men and women, and what might have been children, all naked, all covered in that same dark mixture of mud and blood. They stretched back into the forest as far as the camera could capture, disappearing into the darkness between the trees. The timestamp showed they had been passing that spot for nearly an hour. Over 300 images of the same procession, the same shuffling figures, moving through the forest in the dead of night. I checked the other memory cards. The cameras closer to my camp showed nothing unusual, but the ones I had placed deeper in the forest, farther from any trail or road, had captured similar images. People moving through the darkness, always around 3 in the morning, always heading in the same direction, deeper into the wilderness. I should have packed up my equipment and left that day. I should have driven back to civilization and reported what I had found to the authorities. But I was a photographer. My job was to document the world, to capture images of things that others never saw. And I had captured something extraordinary. I wanted to know more. The next morning, I followed the trail. It was not difficult to find. The procession had left clear signs of their passage: broken branches, trampled undergrowth, footprints in the soft earth that showed bare feet, dozens of them, all heading in the same direction. I followed the trail for nearly 3 hours, pushing through vegetation so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground. The forest grew older and darker the farther I went. The trees were massive, their trunks wider than I was tall. The air smelled of decay and something else, something organic and wrong. The trail led to a creek. It was narrow and shallow, maybe 10 feet across, running over a bed of smooth stones. The water was clear and cold, fed by springs somewhere higher in the mountains. It was a beautiful spot, the kind of place I would normally stop to photograph. But the banks of the creek were covered in bones. They were scattered across the rocks and half buried in the mud, bleached white by sun and water. Most were animal bones, deer, raccoons, birds, but some were not. Some were longer, straighter. Some had joints in places where animal bones did not have joints. I did not look at those too closely. The trail continued along the creek for another half-mile before opening into a clearing. The clearing was circular, maybe 50 feet across, surrounded by the oldest trees I had seen in the forest. The ground was bare, worn smooth by what must have been countless feet over countless years. There was no grass, no undergrowth, just hard-packed earth, the color of dried blood. Symbols had been carved into the rocks around the perimeter. I did not recognize them. They were not letters or numbers or any pictographs I had encountered in my research. They were complex and intricate, covering every available surface, some of them fresh and some worn almost smooth by time. In the center of the clearing, objects had been arranged in careful patterns. Animal skulls, bundles of feathers, stones that had been painted with the same dark substance that covered the bodies in my photographs. They formed concentric circles around a flat rock that might have been an altar. The altar was stained, dark brown, almost black in places. I took photographs. I took dozens of photographs, documenting everything I saw. My hands were shaking so badly that some of the images came out blurred, but I kept shooting. This was evidence. This was proof that something was happening in these mountains, something that no one knew about. I left the clearing and hiked back to my camp as quickly as I could. I packed up my equipment and drove to the nearest town, a small community called Troutdale, about 40 miles from my campsite. I needed to talk to someone. I needed to understand what I had found. I found a local historian at the community library, a woman in her 70s named Margaret, who had spent her life documenting the history and folklore of the region. I showed her my photographs on my laptop, watching her face as she scrolled through the images. Her expression changed from curiosity to recognition to fear. She closed the laptop and pushed it back across the table. She told me to delete the photographs. She told me to destroy the memory cards. She told me to forget I had ever been to that part of the forest. I asked her what I had seen, who those people were, what was happening in that clearing. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she told me there were communities in these mountains that had never been contacted by the outside world, families that had retreated into the wilderness generations ago and never come back. They had their own beliefs, their own rituals, their own way of life that had nothing to do with the modern world. She said outsiders who stumbled upon their ceremonies had a tendency to disappear. I asked her if she meant they were killed. She did not answer the question directly. She just repeated her warning: delete the photographs, destroy the evidence, never go back to that part of the forest. I left the library shaken, but not convinced. I was a journalist as much as a photographer. I believed in documentation. I believed in truth. I was not going to destroy evidence of something this significant just because a small-town historian told me to be afraid. I drove back to my motel and copied the photographs to my laptop. I uploaded them to a cloud server. I made backup copies on multiple drives. I was going to preserve this evidence, even if I never showed it to anyone. Then I went through the images again, more carefully this time. I found something I had missed during my first review. In one of the photographs from the creek, almost hidden in the shadows at the edge of the frame, there was a figure standing apart from the procession. It was not moving with the others. It was standing still, facing the camera, facing me. The resolution was not good enough to make out features. Just a pale shape in the darkness, motionless, while dozens of others shuffled past. But there was something about the posture, something about the angle of the head. It knew the camera was there. It knew it was being watched. I deleted the photographs that night. All of them. The cloud backups, the local copies. Everything except a single memory card that I hid in a safe deposit box in a bank 300 miles from Troutdale. I told myself it was insurance, just in case something happened to me, just in case I needed proof. I finished my project in the Jefferson National Forest, But I never went back to that section of the wilderness. I never went near the creek or the clearing or the trail that led to places no map acknowledged. I captured beautiful images of bears and elk and returned to civilization with a portfolio that earned me praise and additional grants. But I never forgot what I saw. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if they forgot about me. I moved to Colorado after the project ended. I told myself it was for the scenery and the wildlife opportunities. The truth was simpler. I wanted mountains between me and whatever lived in those Virginia hollows. I wanted distance. But distance does not always protect you. Last month, I received a package in the mail. No return address, no postmark, just a plain brown envelope with my name written on the front in handwriting I did not recognize. Inside was a photograph. It was taken at night with the same kind of infrared trail camera I use for my work. The image showed a house, my house. The front porch was clearly visible, the windows dark, the car in the driveway. Standing at the edge of the frame, half hidden in the shadow of a tree, was a figure, naked, covered in something dark, standing perfectly still, watching. I have not slept well since then. I have installed security cameras around my property. I have started locking doors that I used to leave open. I have started carrying a weapon when I go outside after dark. But I know none of it will matter if they decide to come for me. I know too much. I have seen too much. I have evidence hidden in a safe deposit box that could expose secrets they have kept for generations. The memory card is still there. I check on it every few weeks, making sure it has not been tampered with. I tell myself that as long as I have it, I have leverage. As long as I have proof, they cannot afford to do anything to me. But sometimes I wonder if I am wrong. Sometimes I wonder if the memory card is not insurance at all. Sometimes I wonder if it is bait. And sometimes, late at night when the mountains outside my window are black against a blacker sky, I hear something moving in the trees. Footsteps. Many footsteps. Moving in single file. Getting closer.